Zimbabweans head to the polls on Wednesday, the 23rd of August, to elect a president and members of the legislature. 11 candidates are vying for the top position, but as things stand, the contest seems to be between President Emmerson Mnangagwa of ZANU-PF and the Citizens Coalition for Change leader Nelson Chamisa. The Southern African nation has for over a decade been facing high unemployment, poverty and a stagnant economy. Well, let's get a sense of where things are ahead of this election. We're joined by Richard Mahomva, who is a Zimbabwean academic and director of International Communication Services. Richard, good evening to you. Thanks for your time tonight. So, you know, a lot, of course, has been said about what the state of things is in Zimbabwe ahead of this election. We've seen the government on an extensive drive to really portray a narrative of Zimbabwe being able to host free and fair elections where, you know, there's free room to contest and where democracy is really being given space to flourish. Is that the case, Richard, when you look at some of the events that have unfolded?
The fact that all processes that culminate in the election happening, the fact that all those processes have happened, for me, it's a clear expression of the country's adherence to the constitution. And of course, in a healthy democracy, you would witness contestations, because elections by their very nature contested. You had certain candidates that were taking ZEC to the courts, and you had certain candidates at some point that were complaining about the ZEC charges. You had certain candidates, especially in the case of the UNZA presidential candidate, who was later on reinstated by the courts to participate. So there's been this healthy contestation in terms of processes. But I would like to also emphasize something that is very unique about this election, that we have a highly degenerated opposition movement. You'd recall, even prior to the elections, they didn't have formidable structures, and also there are excessive factional divides. And the tragedy that Zimbabweans are going to be confronted with at this particular moment is going into an election with a very fragile opposition in terms of its organization, which to me, I strongly feel it disenfranchises the Zimbabwean that may be interested in voting for the opposition, because they've not been able to mobilize in terms of structures, and even in terms of their polling agents, they've not been able to have a clear framework around that compared to their competitive ruling party, ZANU-PF.
Let's talk about some of the difficulties that those members of the opposition that you have spoken about, that they've experienced just to be able to get to this point in the election. So you make the point that all of the processes that need to be followed have been followed, and therefore it's a sign of democracy being, democracy in action. But the fact that it has taken contestation, including having to go to the courts to give effect to some of these issues, that seems worrying.
Yeah, but the fact that the courts have given audience to all parties concerned, I think for me is a benchmark of constitutionalism at play. But coming back to the issue around the lack of cohesion in the opposition, you'd notice that that particular situation on its own is actually creating a very less competitive environment. And another difficulty that our opposition has, which features very prominently in our current body politic, Kathy, is that you would know that from the early post-land reform era, our opposition was predominantly funded by Western forces, and since 2013 there's been a predominant donor fatigue even to their proxy civil society organizations. So that on its own is also presenting a serious existential crisis, because our opposition was not actually organically rooted to exist on its own. It has been surviving on external donor trinkets, and without that, you are not seeing very vibrant campaigns as you would have seen prior to the 2013 election. So those are some of the difficulties that are quite prevalent and worth recording.
Let's talk about this issue of the voters' role. It's central to this election, and that again seems to be another process that has been quite questionable in as far as at least the finalization of the voters' role, and then handing it over to make sure that even members of the opposition are able to have a sense of its credibility.
Yeah, Kathy, I want to make it clear to the world that we have got a strong misrepresentation of what the law says in Zimbabwe in terms of the Electoral Act. Look, our electoral system has got 3 layers. That is the council, that is the parliamentary, and the presidential election. And our election process, Kathy, is ward-based. So what does it mean if our electoral system is ward-based? It means that the valid voters' roll is one that Kathy finds in your ward, that Kathy finds in your district. So the whole argument about a single voters' roll is an old propaganda narrative from the opposition that has been hinged on a false proposition of calling for electoral reforms. So as a matter of law in Zimbabwe, what matters is a voter's roll from the ward. What matters is a voter's roll from the constituency. This is why even the president goes back and votes in his constituency, because our electoral system is structured in such a manner. There is no overall and overarching voters' roll. So it is one of the preemptory, positions of the opposition to say, well, we're not given the voters' roll, and because of that, we were cheated. So the truth of the matter is that there is no legal position that warrants the creation of a homogeneous or a single voters' roll that is representative of the constituency dividends of our people.
But surely it can't be incorrect for members of the opposition to want to see the updated voters' roll and have a sense of what that looks like, even if it is in individual wards.
Well, you don't start raising that conversation 2 weeks before the elections, whereas there was an opportunity for 5 years in Parliament for a standing legal provision of the Electoral Act to be changed, but they could not do that in the past 5 years, and they could not do that even around 2013, because we're talking about an Electoral Act that has existed for more than a decade, and they have not been able to emphasize that concern in the past. And what is so different now for them to start talking about that narrative? They should have resolved that in Parliament, where they have a significant number that was going to be able to move a motion in their favor, but they could not do it. So it actually means we have got an opposition that has got misplaced priorities.
But if we look at the argument that is being made by the CCC and in part of its documents that it put before the court, it's also arguing that there are new polling stations that have been set up and that thousands of voters have also been moved to different polling stations, which of course creates further confusion to the issue of the voters' roll, which is why they want to see what those updated lists look like.
Okay, so you see, Kathy, what happens is our constitution is very clear on the decade timeline for the delimitation. So the issue of delimitation is something that the opposition knew about 10 years back before they even got their fresh mandate in 2018. So after the delimitation process was concluded, you'd recall that there was a ZEC blitz by the Electoral Commission that each and every Zimbabwean who is registered to vote should go and ensure that their names are within the electoral jurisdictions that are determined by the delimitation process. So there was no need for even ZANU-PF itself to actually complain. Of course, there were complaints on the part of ZANU-PF, but there was even no need for ZANU-PF to even raise those complaints because the issue of the delimitation process is only linked to a Zimbabwean registered in a particular constituency taking it upon themselves to go and ensure that they are in their rightful constituency.
But the difficulty that has been raised again by the difficulty that has been raised again by the CCC is that what it has picked up, one of the anomalies that it has picked up with the current voters' roll, is that you have the identification and ID numbers and names of candidates that had been linked, and verified in the 2013-11 that also appear in this voters' roll, but under different names.
Well, those are technicalities that should have been resolved when ZEC started its process of checking who is in the voters' roll and who is not.
And the fact that they haven't been resolved surely will affect the credibility of the election.
No, it does not, because if you know that you are a candidate, you should be able to ensure that your credentials are located within the correct constituency where you are campaigning. And let me also take you back around some issues linked to the delimitation report. Do you know that out of that process, there are some MPs on the part of the ruling party that actually lost constituencies and were no longer legitimate to contest? And why are we not having these complaints on the other part of the political divide? Right. This clearly points out that there are certain players that want to create preemptory arguments about a fraudulent electoral process because they know that they are going to lose. And how are they going to lose? They didn't set up relevant structures. They didn't even have an electoral congress. They do not even have a standing constitution. And in this stance, they do not even have a functional office where they actually operate from. They actually do not even have a sufficient number of polling agents. So when you look at those internal structural deficiencies on the part of the CCC, it is quite clear that out of their institutional weaknesses, they are definitely set to lose the elections.
Right.
Therefore, they are trying to raise these technical issues that are not predicated on the law because this debate is centered around the Electoral Act. And if anything, they should be arguing with the terms and the clauses of the Electoral Act. And they failed to actually have an advocacy
and
to change that.
Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I have to leave it there with you for tonight. He is a Zimbabwean academic and international communication services